circle begins in Mankato, Minnesota. 38 Dakota men are hanged in a mass execution. Their families imprisoned or scattered across the plains. When the wars ended, the cultural war began. The people traced the paths of the Dakota Exile.
Minnesota Centuries, the story of the people, places, and events that have made us who we are. Funding for this Minnesota Centuries program was provided by the St. Paul Companies, providing insurance products and services throughout the world. Additional funding was provided by the Minnesota Humanities Commission in cooperation with the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Minnesota State Legislature.
They separated the great Dakota nation.
We really didn't have a reservation anymore. They threw it open to the white man.
The plan was for the government to say, look, let's take the language away so they lose their spirit.
Yes, we were oppressed people, but we could say that we have survived.
Nobody's going to shut us up now, huh? We are going to stand up for what is rightfully ours, huh?
When I go back into Minnesota and I see how rich it is, how black the dirt is, what comes into my mind is that we lived here. I mean, we lived here one time.
In a creation story of the Dakota, Mother Earth gave birth to the first grandmother and grandfather in the heart of the upper Mississippi, in the place they call Minnesota. From their descendants came the 4 tribes of the eastern Dakota, the Bedewa-Kantuwa, the people of the Mystic Lake, the Wahpekute, the hunters in the leaves. Further west were the Sisituwa, the fish camp people, and their relatives, the Wahpetuwa, the dwellers in the leaves. 4 counts of fires in the great Dakota nation. The Dakota were the first of their people to encounter the invasion of the whites. For 200 years, they fought against them and alongside them, traded with them, became their relatives, and adopted some of their ways. But as a crush of new immigrants arrived, they soon found they were not wanted in their own land. They were in the way of white progress. A series of treaties were made, and each time promises, bribes, and threats yielded more and more land. Until by 1858, the Dakota were confined to a small strip of land along the Minnesota River. When treaty payments did arrive, the money was taken by the traders.
And the trader said, well, the Indians owe me that because they've been ichazoing here, getting credit. He said, well, if they're hungry, tell them to go out and eat grass. What kind of talk is that from civilized people?
What food was given first to those who cut their hair and left their traditional ways. But most Dakota people resisted efforts to destroy their culture. When the American Civil War began, rumors came from Washington that treaty payments would not be made. Traders cut off credit in food, and when the corn crop failed and the money did not come, starvation did. By August of 1862, the Dakota would surrender no more of their culture, nor beg for food at the government warehouse. They went to war to take back their land. War parties swept through the Minnesota River Valley. In terrible fighting, over 500 whites were killed. The Dakota dead were never counted. By September, the U.S. Army ended the war. Most of the Dakota chose to flee. It was the last time they would live together as one nation. 1,700 Dakota people, mostly women and children, were taken to St. Paul and held in a prison camp below Fort Snelling on the Mississippi River. Politicians called for exile or extermination, while the press fed the hysteria.
There was almost no truth being allowed out about us. Everything that was being said about us was a creation of some person of European descent's imagination of how to stir people up against us.
Military trials condemned over 300 men. In a compromise with the state, Abraham Lincoln lowered the number to 38. On the day after Christmas, 1862, the Dakota men were put to death in Mankato, Minnesota. To heighten the effect of the execution, all 38 were hung at one time from a single gallows. The largest mass execution in U.S. history.
But when we were walking up that steps there to the gallows, one Indian was walking up. Hodena uketa kusita sunk upsnigash de no yakta pisa. Ai senu yakwap katusta tokata inonach. Evoka suedia iptedo.
But I was glad when an eyewitness told about how they went, they had sung their death songs. They didn't flinch or hang back, just went. That's the Indian philosophy too. Whatever is going to happen is going to happen.
In the despair that followed the hanging, the missionaries found their greatest success among the Dakota. Conversions were many. They made a bonfire of sacred medicine bundles.
The hanging, it had to have hurt the tribe as a whole, their spirit. You know, this whole group of people that lived in Minnesota one time. And possibly, you know, the spirit hasn't recovered yet, you know.
The prisoners at Fort Snelling did not fight during the war, but this distinction was lost on the citizens of Minnesota. After a bitter winter, the survivors were packed onto steamboats and exiled to Dakota Territory.
Well, they weren't only forced to leave, they almost manhandled them to leave. And they were so packed, they were taken out.
Further south on the Mississippi, one of the boats transferred prisoners to railroad boxcars. They were taken overland to a point upstream on the Missouri River. There, all 1,300 prisoners were crowded into one boat. One missionary compared their conditions to the Middle Passage of African slaves. The boat would stop at times to bury the dead. Their new reservation was a drought-stricken place called Crow Creek.
Chonki jakse hechia doketuha. Dakota ki hachona umpi. Sa ojuha hu iak bemini heche hu ki hena snipik deshni. Wea ki hena sa ojuha ki hena akichita etaha ichupi. Heake hena isto waniche. Michakbi washteun.
Food rations were in short supply, but the government agent would not let the Dakota leave the reservation to hunt. 300 people died the first winter. The surrounding hills were filled with children's graves. After 3 years, Crow Creek was abandoned. The Dakota moved downstream to a new reservation in Nebraska. It was named Santee. At the same time, the last Dakota men were released from a military prison in Davenport, Iowa. Together, they would build a community.
We had our rations, but we lived off the land, the berries, planting our own corn, the fish, the game. We survived together in what they call it the Devil's Nest area, you know. Brazil Creek area, Hall Creek area, and the Santee here, 4 districts, but we survived together. We're in an isolated pocket, not only in the state of Nebraska, but also from our brothers and sisters. And we have always stressed this to other Dakota bands, that we're still in exile from our original homeland.
In the wake of the conflict, thousands of Dakota people fled Minnesota for the plains of Dakota Territory. The government sent the army to find their camps and destroy them.
And my grandfather was the one that told us he walked. When he was 4 years old, he left Minnesota. They fled. But hardly ever slept that night. They had to get up and go. And they came here and it stopped here.
The Dakota took refuge among their relatives, the Ihonktuwa, on the shores of a lake that was a traditional winter haven.
White people called it Devil's Lake. This is Minnewakan, holy water, spirit water, mystic water.
Among the refugees was a young Sissetuan chief named Tatanka Najin, or Standing Buffalo. Standing Buffalo had spoken out against the violence in Minnesota. But as the war ended, he could not trust the Americans to be merciful. He and his people would wander for years without a home. To the south, many of his relatives took their chances with the government. They were gathered on the western side of the Big Stone Lake at the edge of the high prairie near the Minnesota border.
Once they could no longer be in Minnesota, the natural place was here to come and be along the plateau. They offered them protection. They knew where the water was, knew where plants were, food. Everything was here.
In 1867, a group of Dakota leaders under Gabriel Renville approached the government to secure a reservation for their people.
My great-grandfather Gabriel, he chose this place. That he wanted to be buried someplace high. And I think all tribal groupings will say they want to be buried in a high place. So it was his wish, that he would always be able to, look into the Minnesota Valley. Generations, following him probably do not remember. They remember only this place.
The politicians recognized Gabriel Renville as the new head chief of the Sissetuan and Wahpetuan peoples. He signed the Treaty of 1867, which established both the Sisseton, or Lake Traverse Reservation, and in the heart of present-day North Dakota, the Devil's Lake Reservation.
After 1862, when everything calmed down and the government had to relook at its policy, a great wrong had been done here, and they had to decide where all of these people were going to go. The leaders of the time chose this place.
Gabriel Renville remains a controversial figure. Many of his actions created divisions among the Dakota, which linger still. But like many Dakota leaders, he defies an easy stereotype. In the winter of 1862, Renville had been a prisoner at Fort Snelling. There he buried many of his relatives. In exchange for the release of Dakota prisoners, he offered to scout for the army. And later in life, though most Dakota farmers were Christianized, he resisted conversion.
I used to hear comments about my great-grandfather. He was the chief of the scouts. He did this and he did that, And for a time in my life, I had a hard time dealing with that. And I said, I don't believe this, what they're saying. But I think it took time to understand that here was a man caught in the middle. Who am I to say, or anyone else to judge how a man is? when I looked at it that way, I said, you know, if they pointed a gun at my great-grandfather and were going to shoot his family or shoot the people, he had to make a choice of wanting his people to live, because he made a decision that affected all of us.
In 1863, the American Army pushed Standing Buffalo and his people north into British-held territory. The Dakota called the border the Medicine Line and used it to their advantage. For 3 years, they wandered back and forth to search for food and to meet with other nations. By 1865, Standing Buffalo arrived in northeastern Montana. The Assiniboine were the dominant nation in the area. As distant relatives, the Dakota understood their language, but they had been enemies for hundreds of years. Here, the young chief successfully displayed his skill as negotiator. The two nations held ceremonies with the pipe and made peace. They became family. Non-Indians thought Montana wild and unsettled. For the Assiniboine and Dakota, the land was their lifeblood. Montana held the last of the great buffalo herds in the United States. And by 1860, more and more of the Dakota Nation moved into the region. In spring of 1871, 500 lodges of various Dakota bands were competing for space with other nations. Fighting broke out, and Standing Buffalo was killed in battle. His son and some of his followers moved north into Canada. Later that year, the Fort Peck Indian Agency was established to serve both the Assiniboine and Dakota people. The reservation was 110 miles long and 40 miles wide, encompassing over 3,000 square miles. Living alongside the Assiniboine, the Fort Peck Sioux tribe is represented by the Sasituan, Wakpetuan, Hunkpapa, and Ihunktuwani. Once the buffalo herds were gone, the cattle companies moved in, and the cowboy lifestyle became part of the Dakota experience. Rodeo champions are still born and raised on the Fort Peck Reservation. Fort Peck is typical of a number of reservations with small pockets of Dakota people. But while the Dakota searched for their relatives in the United States, a large part of the family was missing.
It was about the same time, early 1970s. Somebody told me that I think 2 days before the group was leaving that we were taking a large bus into Manitoba, Canada. And I said, why? Why are you guys all going up there? And they said, because some of our people are up there. I said, what do you mean? Somebody from Morton went up there? And they said, no, they've been living up there since 1862. And I said, you got to be kidding me.
The Dakota fought alongside the British in 2 wars against the Americans. Now, in time of need, they came to the north.
When the uprising took place, before that they were left with a promise from the British government that if we ever encounter any problems with the American Army, to come back, look north. If you see red, white, and blue in the clouds, head back that way and we'll look after you. Some of them, after 50 years, they still remember that.
Stories of the war in Minnesota arrived in the British territories before the Dakota. They've been regarded as refugees ever since. Today, the tiny Dakota reserves are scattered across the Canadian Northwest. Many in the same locations as when they first arrived in 1862. The people of Standing Buffalo's band set up camp on the shores of the Qu'Appelle Lakes in present-day Saskatchewan. A band of the Wakpetuan found their home on the Assiniboine River in west-central Manitoba. It came to be known as the Sioux Valley Dakota Nation.
There you go. Conshua, he sister on a town. A cost pataka 40 acre hedge where there you take. Or hata unkandik chiu. Or hedge conshi water. Hata ta coas na head walls, but ta coas no. Yet no talk with a tap at the town walk no adoption. It's mask kakamana umpe. Teep kokagaba. Ta was no tana pico chaya bone water. Kunshana water the head.
And I know what the kid. I know what's there.
Because the Dakota had not relinquished lands to the Canadian government by treaty, they were not given the same benefits as other Native peoples in Canada. But the Dakota claimed the land long before there was a Canada.
No, this is our land here before that.
They were here before that.
Yeah. Don't ever get the idea that border like we were just confined to that side, huh? This is our land, and we lived here before the white man came here.
My dad will, if I go back there, they'll get me, It's because he's a hereditary chief. So they were afraid of that. At that age, they were sort of reluctant to go back into states.
They were even afraid to talk about it.
Yeah, well, they're even afraid to talk about it,
It's not a fence or it's not a concrete wall, but still there's a separation of relative. And we still speak about relatives in a close manner, and still there is the boundary there.
Living in sparsely populated areas, the Canadian Dakota were more insulated from the effects of European colonization. As a result, they have managed to retain much of their language and culture.
Not only had they survived, but they'd stayed strong. It was like a family reunion. It wasn't like we'd never seen them before. It was like, this is okay. Even the way they sat around the table was just like ours. The way they made their coffee, the way they drank their coffee, everything was just like us, even though we'd never seen each other. All those things were alike, and it was great.
I've heard a lot of Indian people say that they didn't care about property. And they said as long as the reservation stands, we'll always have land.
As the West filled with Yankees and Europeans, the government came under more and more pressure to open the reservations for settlement. They claimed the Indians were not using the land. In the East, self-proclaimed friends of the Indians were deciding what was best for Native peoples. The answer to the Indian problem, they said, was for Indians to give up their tribal lands and become individual property-holding farmers.
How do we quickly implement a system for assimilation? And the quickest way to do is individualize those people and make them into farmers and put a boundary around them. And then when we do talk about farming, it becomes a purpose of a person's own materialistic image. It's no more the life of the tribe.
In order to satisfy both reformists and land-hungry whites, Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts introduced the General Allotment Act of 1887, which stated that each Indian family would receive 160 acres to farm and be instructed on how to use the land properly.
Then the land that wasn't allotted to Indians was open for homesteading. I don't know, maybe it's safe to say at least half the reservation was lost. But isn't that crazy, huh? They say, here's your boundaries, this is yours now. Okay, fine, we settle down here. And all of a sudden, no, we're going to give you each we're going to give you 160 acres apiece. And you make use of it in a good way. What about the rest? How about our kids? No, your kids are going to inherit your land, what we gave you.
After being uprooted by the government so many times, some Indian people thought the allotments would guarantee them a home. But the people from the Sisseton Reservation had seen it all before.
If you read the 1867 treaty, it states in there that heads of household would be allotted 160 acres. So even before Henry Dawes came up with the legislation, it had already been tried here, and it failed. Because again, land was the concession, that Dakota people had to make. It didn't matter whether or not it worked.
The government had taken advantage of a decline in the native population to open the reservations for settlement. By the time the Dawes Act came to an end, native lands had been reduced by more than 2/3. Half of what was left was too poor to farm.
My great-grandfather, he died of a broken heart. This land that he thought would be here for generations to come. And that's how older people look at land. They say, we're not going to own this land. It's here for our use and for generations to come. As they come, they will use this land.
But the Dawes Act was more than a conspiracy to gain Indian lands. It was an open attempt by the government to assimilate native peoples into mainstream American society. The goal was to Americanize Native Americans. And on the reservations, Indian agents saw native language and spirituality as barriers to that goal.
The missionaries knew how to gain the confidence, gain the trust. They spoke Dakota. How many missionaries would come from the east? I mean, you had to be dedicated to come here in the middle of nowhere to be a missionary to Dakota people. Quite a challenge. Nevertheless, they did this.
My grandpa and my grandma, they're tough Indians. We come to church, and they read the Bible Indian, and we sing Indian.
They say in the 1870s, each district had a church. They built their own churches. Each district also had Indian ministers. This is 1870s.
Missionaries had been with the Dakota since the 1830s. They defended them at Fort Snelling and followed them into exile. And while they taught and preached in Dakota, it was simply a medium for the message. A message of assimilation and change.
And then pretty soon the priest came in, all decked out in something. For sure, this is another country, right here. What are they going to do to us now, I think? I was too scared to cry. But later on, I got used to it.
At first, each reservation was assigned a Christian denomination by the government. While Sisseton was given to the Presbyterians, Devil's Lake went to the Roman Catholics.
And yet they used to tell us, don't ever go in any other church. It's the devil's church. Don't go in there. And it shocked me because my father wasn't the devil. He treated me better than the sisters ever did. My mother treated me better than the sisters ever did. So I couldn't admit it. So to this day, I'm Catholic. But there's a division, as I have to tell the priest. Every time he comes, I try to get it out. I'm trying to make him understand why some of us felt like that. But it was such a different world from ours.
And I used to watch my grandfather. Every morning, before the sun come up, he's outside and he's praying. Sometimes he sings, sometimes he doesn't. But he's, he's talking to the Great Spirit in his own language, but he's praying.
From the time the reservations were established, Indian agents and missionaries tried to stop traditional ceremonies and dances. In 1883, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs issued a ban on what he called the demoralizing and barbarous customs of the Sioux.
Who you are, your own identity, is very important. Cultures are part of that, languages are part of that, your beliefs, your ceremonies, that's a part of you. Being who you are far outweighs anything you would have to do in the non-Indian world.
And they discouraged like powwows, dancing, any of these things, but they were carried on in secret.
I thought we were the first to initiate a sweat lodge ceremony on this reservation. Here I found out that our elders had it, but it was way in the back. Only 3 or 4 people would pray in that way, and they wouldn't even tell their peers, because that's how much fear was implanted into our people's minds, that was bad. But they held on. They kept it going. They kept it going.
They liked to go to these Indian ceremonies, but they wouldn't tell us where. But I knew that they were being held someplace. I wanted to see it so bad, but my father wouldn't take me.
I remember my mother, she said when she was little, they would have powwow or chipi, and then they would have to cover up all the windows, with blankets. They would have the kerosene lamps on, but they would cover up all the windows so no light could go out. And then, of course, they walked there, so there weren't any horses or whatever. But she said that's the only way they could have powwow.
They had a Sundance in Wolf Point one time. I was really young then. I must be about 8, 9, 10 years old. Early in the morning, they start down towards the woods to get the leaves to prepare for the Sundance. And the noise they made, wild Indians.
The ultimate of life is to suffer the pain that our mothers have gone through to bear a child to put on earth. Sacrifice of hunger, sacrifice of meditation, sacrifice of loneliness when they are up in a vision quest. And then you sit down, join the Sundance. It comes to a point where the ultimate sacrifice happens when you're pierced and hanging from the tree of life. And that's the beginning of faith.
Tako ajihede naku hanata Dakota no oicha kawoicha de you have he de wichaha pidechi piab de woite era umo he naku hata naji he chata hana woicha de he de you ha uba he hena de hana nach she jech sampa un spiritual kiaba henach ayap de it's ayap da wake wo which the hek suta do hanaji piwita to keta ocha he piap ka her was we chota aiga no oxia it's a henach no do happy.
Today a lot of them are gone, like there's a Thanksgiving ceremony, special way that's done, and the horse ceremonies and stuff like that. There's so much of it. It's a way of life. Some of them have already gone in a wayside. It will never be identified here today. But there will be a time to claim that it will come back in its visions and dreams.
For untold generations, the children learned the Dakota way of life from their elders. And through turbulent times, the keepers and teachers of language and culture were the grandmothers.
When we stayed out at my grandma's out at Crow Hill a lot. Once we'd say, we want to go to Corn Sheaf. So they'd take us and drop us out there, and we'd stay. We'd stay for a long time, a week at a time. And then in the evening, when we had a big teepee outside all the time in the summer, and we slept out there. In fact, that's how I would go to sleep, hearing her tell about things.
They kept everything going. They're tanning, beating, with moccasins, star blankets.
The grandmother is one that would teach the boys and the girls about the language and the humbleness of the grandmother's way of language, emotion of the language itself, the sacredness of the language itself. What has to have respect and honor is within the language as the grandmother would teach the children, the grandchildren.
The most obvious targets for assimilation were the children. The government found that boarding schools were the most effective way to strip them of their language and culture. The schools cut into the fabric of Dakota culture like a million little knives.
Imagine little tiny kids. I was only 5 years old when I first went to school. It was such a strange place. Strange buildings, strange smells.
Like, you know, when you're 6 years old and you're away from home for 9 months, and your parents can't get to you even to come and visit you because they didn't have no car. It was pretty hard, you know, because I went through that life, you know.
I sort of remember people standing all around me, talking to me, and I couldn't understand them. And they were calling me a name I didn't know. They were calling me my English name.
It was military style, you know. I was always in Company E because I was so short. When my sister was in Company D, I'd look for her and see if I could find her, you know. Stand up straight. You couldn't turn your head. You had to just stand there like that. They took us to school like that. They took us to meals like that.
Everybody was dressed alike. Your dresses were all alike. Your shoes are all alike. And you were allowed one pair of shoes. And if you destroyed those shoes any way or form, you were punished.
All the life skills that you can think of, you're taught there. Feed pigs, chickens, or handle horses, or cows, or bulls, or whatever. It was all there. And I learned that at school, and that's how I made my living after I left school.
And my mother wanted me to take home economics, so you can learn how to cook and sew and become domesticated. You had to work certain shifts, you know, in the dining room, or you had to work in the laundry, or because we went to school just half days, and you had to work for a living or work for your keep the other half day.
The boarding schools were small worlds unto themselves. Student farmers grew wheat, student metal workers fixed the plows, and student bakers baked the bread. But the Indian schools did more than teach European ways. They denied Dakota ways. Their philosophy was, kill the Indian and save the man.
What I like to obadakochi, takomani no iwaiktik I'll have to use the foreign language, the white language, you know. I'll have to use that because boarding school, some of the things I wanna express into a so I have to use the foreign language.
The children will come home and say, we cannot speak Dakota, it's against the law. They say that it's Satan's language. You know, it's language of the unseen, the bad side. We cannot speak it.
We weren't allowed to talk our language, so that most of us forgot our language, you know, because I could talk fluent Dakota. But over the years, I start losing it because you only could talk English.
If you said something to another student, you get your hands slapped with a ruler.
In those days, you were punished with a strap. They had a strap that they strap you with. And then they'd make you kneel in the hall, and boy, your knees got sore. You know, you got punished maybe for 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a time.
And I think a lot of those people that went through the boarding schools and suffered and to great amounts have lost their spirit. And that's what they say, they got to find their spirit in order to heal.
I know when I went to school there, like, they took everything away from me, my language first, and then the white man's ways was pounded into me, but when I got out of school, like, you know, it wasn't my roots,
And I even wake up crying. As old as I am, I'm in my 70s, I even wake up crying sometimes because I'm dreaming I'm being taken back to the Indian school, you know? We dreaded it, but we had to go.
Like what they took away is a way of life, a way of spiritual strength, something that should be left untouched.
In 1934, the Bureau of Indian Affairs finally recognized that the eradication of native languages was not necessary for the education of native children. The official government suppression of native culture, languages, and ceremonies was abandoned, but the damage had been done.
My did Dakota unkiapte käpjä.
Dakota unkiapte. Okahte kapsittisnikti.
Mis wana oda kapu homo hite.
Hey.
Wat donkte on wana wakisni.
I just love it when I meet people like me right here and we can just talk in Indian, just rattle away, nobody to tell us to keep still or punish us or...
Dakota did that won't that the case that picked the church. It was, I guess, it that picked the storage. I know at one time I don't even know the English. The only language I know was the Sioux Indian.
The language is the spirit of our lives. The language is Mother Earth. The language is the spirit of life in the universe. It's a sacred language. It's a language that's going to communicate yourself to the spirit world of your grandfathers and grandmothers that have gone on before you.
The thing that I really see started to die was our language, our Dakota language, because they didn't even want to speak their language in public. And so it was always an honor for me to sit there and listen to the elders talk their language, you know.
Yeah. It's okay. I bet you can. Mahajuk, they said,
Dit is je magaju.
It is walking a hotuma. Makang, chon.
And now, a lot of these children, they don't even know how to talk Indian. They don't understand Indian. And when we don't want them to hear something, like my niece, and we talk in Indian, and then we don't want them to hear, so and they always get kind of mad and discouraged. I say, talk the way we do. Don't talk. You're talking funny. Just a few of us like her and I, and maybe about the only ones that we could talk. But these young ones, they're not interested in talking their own language. So maybe that's going to be lost.
Well, something has to be done.
Yeah.
Something has to be done.
You see, some schools wanted to hire some teachers to teach, but they wouldn't hire him or me because we're elders, we're old. They want somebody with a diploma.
We've said that. Why don't we hire some elders instead of, hiring university graduates, huh? They don't know what they're talking about. Sure, it's easy to learn from a book, but you have to put that into into practical, and it's different, huh?
Our native children going to public schools should not be forced to take a foreign language. It's so foreign to them, like German or Russian or French or Spanish or something else. Let's teach them their own language.
And that's probably my number one goal as a man, is to know my language. That's going to be my major goal, is to learn my language.
Pidamai. Ja, niin, missä pidamai. Se tostemai.
Joo, hätsetty.
I'm very proud that my family chose to come back. I have a great deal of respect for all of my Dakota relatives, but I'm very glad my family came back.
In 1862, the governor of Minnesota called for the extermination or banishment of every Dakota within the state's borders. There was a $200 bounty placed on their scalps. Still, after 20 years of imprisonment and exile, a few people returned, some to the Minnesota River Valley, where the violence first started.
When my mother and father first came, they lived below the hill. They said up the top was all barren. There was no one except farmers here and there. And the farmers would shoot at them if they came up. But they all came up to church. The church was here. And they said as they came up the road, the families, each one would come out and meet them. By the time they got up here, there'd be a lot of them with their children. The church was safe for them, but after that, they'd go right back to the woods, you know. They had to stay hid most of the time.
Trickling back from South Dakota and Nebraska, a handful of families formed the nucleus of the Birch Coulee settlement at a place they called Transhayapi. They paint the trees red. By 1886, there were 16 teepees and a few small farms near the banks of the Minnesota River.
The 1880s was essentially when the biggest number came back. We bought the land we'd never been paid for. Paid for the land that was our land that was taken away, and it's hard to understand, but buying land that was ours that someone else took away and promised to pay, we had to pay for it, even though it was ours.
We didn't have money to go buy meat. We had to go hunting and fishing and so forth, and if we didn't get anything, then we didn't have any meat that day. So we grew up on a lot of potato soup. They thought all the Indians were dying, and they called us the disappearing race. They didn't know we were back in the hills.
The villages of the Dakota once lined the shores of the Mississippi River. Towns like Red Wing and Wabasha were named for their chiefs. In the late 1870s, stories began to circulate that Indians were camped on an island upriver. Red Wing's people had returned.
Prairie Island used to be one of the better places to gather medicine. I couldn't speak for all the families. I could only speak for one. I mean, God always remember that. The family that raised me came back here primarily for medicine, and that our relatives were buried around this area. I do it sometimes myself, you know. I know what they look like and where they are, what they used to. Because that's the way I grew up. All the different hunting techniques and all the different gathering techniques and also philosophies that went with them. They stress how these pertain to the Wakantua's way of life.
Prairie Island was what you call a real community. The Indians and the non-Indians, they all were a community. They went to church together. They had social gatherings together.
A few white farmers helped shield the Dakota people from the outside world, and the Dakota helped them in return. Prairie Island had sandy soil and was a miserable place to farm. In the face of severe poverty, the families did many things to survive.
Hunting and trapping, putting on Indian shows, like at the state fair. My grandma and I and my mother, we would go away to Lake Minnetonka, to that big hotel they had over there, and we'd sell souvenirs there to those rich people who come from the East Coast to vacation, and they would buy all our beadwork. 3 cents a piece for those doll moccasins. They had to make $500 a week, the family together, to make $15, you know, so we could buy groceries. When I was a child, my favorite memories was running and playing out in the woods, down by the river. Play all day long. We'd fish, we'd swim. We didn't realize, but we were bringing food to the home, because we would be fishing all day. They had to work so hard to survive, you know, and they never gave up, never gave up. This is home. This is home. I don't care how many years you live someplace else. This is home to them.
I think there's no question that there is going to be reunification in Minnesota. Maybe we're not all going to move back, but we're all going to come back and we're all going to put together what needs to be put together. We're going to put that circle back together.
A healing has to begin with the spiritual part of us, you know, and I don't think that's happened, you know. It takes a long time, you know, for the spirit to get well.
Waspeduta. Do once a. Oyate aku. Kuka ichahadamane.
Every year in September, the names of the 38 Dakota men are read aloud at dawn. Food is offered for their spirits, and Dakota people from every community gather at Mankato, the place of the hanging, to honor their memory. And every year, eagles fly overhead as the drums and voices rise up from below.
The spirits of the 38 are here, and the eagles are looking after the gathering here to see that there's no problem. That's why they come here.
To be who we really were meant to suffer loss of our home and loss of many of our lives and loss of our rights as human beings. But it was so powerful that it was worth maintaining that differentness. And we still feel that way. That's why we still do the Mankato powwow. That's why we still do it. And that's why we insist that we have to start teaching people who we are. And no more nachma cheese, no more hidden things, but to begin telling people this is who we really are. This is who we've always been. Way down inside where it really counts. This is who we really are still.
Prayers are always made by our Indian nations to reach out to other nations, that we would one day come together in understanding, and that we would share to use each other's ways of life, the purpose of life.
How to consider? Ato kantaka. Kuya hito dedon siya takto kukupecha. Hana tokata kia shitecha wakapka. Hana upachne kabastodiamt. Hechomata devita ya uyankabade. Ka okta ukawita okta hi. Oshon pidaba on kuaba ejon tompo. Koda pichia puaste vichakaya. Unkakshi haftido. How much I pay us?